extension statistics for the month. Then there was also the unexpectedly large foreign trade balance surplus, as well as ABSA Purchasing Managers Index. That's reflecting more positive sentiment among manufacturers in that period. And next in January, we also saw new vehicle sales looking a little better. Then the quarterly policy uncertainty index of the Northwest University School of Business for the fourth quarter 2016 was also released. Finally, Donald Trump, the president of the US, had another tumultuous week in office. So, to help us unpack these issues, we are joined by Prof Raymond Parsons of the Northwest University School of Business and Governance in our weekly slot of the economy. Professor, welcome.
Good morning, Elvis.
Let's begin with the good news about the trade balance, with imports falling and exports rising, as well as vehicle sales looking much better. What is it telling us, Professor?
Well, I think, Elvis, you'll recall we've often spoken about the tale of two deficits that we worry about. That is the trade deficit in South Africa and the fiscal deficit, which we still have to worry about. But so this is good news. It means there is some progress here in us being able to pay our way in the world by doing much better on the export front. And in fact, this is probably largely due to the somewhat better commodity prices on the world markets for those things that we sell. And also, of course, I think that we've had a fairly competitive exchange rate. And I think those twin factors have actually helped to boost exports. The downside is that, of course, imports have fallen. Now, you may say, well, hurrah, but
yes,
the fact is, it means that many business people are not importing any equipment, they're not investing. So, in fact, the fall in imports, to some extent, reflects the weak economy. So it's two sides of a coin. But I think on the balance, we've got to be very pleased that over the past 2 years, our exports have grown by something like 22%. And that's good news.
Now, the credit extension figures, do they tell us anything? And what do they tell us about households and their position where they are in 2017?
Well, I think all households that are watching this interview will know what the pincher movement is. It's either from unemployment, if you've lost your job, or if you don't have a job, then you're either not going to take out credit or you're not going to get credit. So I think that's the one pressure point. The other is the question of inflation. You go into the supermarkets, you see that the prices have been rising, especially that of food prices. So this puts pressure on households. I don't think it's going to change very much this year. It'll still be a sort of vulnerable point in our economic outlook. Bearing also in mind, I think that many households and consumers are beginning to pick up the message that in the budget, which comes at the end of this month, there may be increased taxes. That's going to also squeeze some of the disposable income, or might even perhaps put up some prices if they're indirect taxes. So I think that element of uncertainty among consumers explains why they are being very cautious about household debt and are wanting to wind it down, or at least not take out extra debt.
Talking about uncertainty, the latest Northwest University School of Business Policy Uncertainty Index showed that policy uncertainty in South Africa was lower in the fourth quarter 2016 than in the third quarter of last year. What were the main factors explaining and driving this, Professor?
Well, I think there were 3 or 4 factors in the fourth quarter of last year which helped to stabilize the level of policy uncertainty. Firstly, of course, there was the good news that that we were not downgraded by the credit rating agencies. I think that was a reprieve, only for 6 months maybe, but nonetheless. Then was also had the issue of a very good mini budget, which gave out a strong message from government and from the Treasury that we do want to get our public finances under control. We do want to control government spending. We don't want to borrow too much, because if you don't control spending and you don't control borrowing, you have to put up taxes, which is where we're going to end up anyway, but at least the margin has been narrowed. And then also, I think the fact that we had a fairly strong currency, that was also, I think, a stabilizing factor in the whole environment of uncertainty. And then finally, the fact that the charges against the Minister of Finance were dropped in the fourth quarter. I think that all helped to explain why we got a degree of stabilization in the level of policy uncertainty in South Africa.
What do you believe, though, Professor, will be the driving forces influencing this policy and uncertainty perceptions, one way or the other, as we move towards 2015? Because there's a number of issues here. If we look at the examples of the events, such as the Cabinet Lekgotla that happened this week, there was also the State of the Nation address next week, which is coming, as well as the possibility of a cabinet reshuffle, and then, of course, the budget in February 2017.
Well, I think, Elvis, what we've got to dig down here, if we put a dipstick into all these events, what has been the common factor? Every time there's been a spokesman from the ANC top brass or for the Lekgotla, it's been top of our agenda is the economy. So I think there's a recognition that we're not doing as we ought to do. There are big challenges, they have not been resolved yet, and that we ought to have a much better economic performance. What we should be doing about it is obviously a matter which the ANC, among other parties, has been heavily seized with. Now what's important is these events, such as the State of the Nation, whether there's a cabinet reshuffle, who's in, who's out, once the music stops, as it were, the issue of the budget, what taxes will go up or not. These will all influence the level of confidence and the levels of uncertainty, not only among business people, but also by the man in the street. He wants to know what will be the future direction. And so, of course, the next big opportunity will be the State of the Nation address next week. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the Cabinet Lekgotla has been devoted not only to our economy, but to what should the message be. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for the President to spell out in a consistent and a coherent way what is the path forward for the country and for our economy, so that we can reduce uncertainty and boost investor confidence.
Just lastly and briefly, Professor, President Donald Trump continues to dominate the global conversation. What can we read from all of this?
Well, I think it was President Obama said that, of course, elections have consequences, and of course he was pointing to what has been happening now that President Trump is in the White House. We said last week that when you look at what he's doing, what you see is what you get. I don't think anyone should be under any sort of illusions. So there have been a number of important decisions. But I also see the signs of a team emerging. Now that the cabinet is being approved, you're starting to see some moderating voices that perhaps things could be a little different and so forth. So that as President Trump builds up a team, so I think you will see a more coherent message, whether you like it or not, but it'll be a more coherent message. I think for South Africa, one of the interesting things for the business community was the executive order about deregulation. I think that will find much resonance here. And I think that's an important issue even for our own policymakers, that we must lighten regulation, especially for small business. So I would simply say in conclusion, all the factors that we've now listed, whether it's the State of the Nation or the budget or whatever it may be, this is an important month in February. We may have the State of the Nation, the budget, and a cabinet reshuffle. So my advice, as always, watch the space.
Professor, thank you so much for your time joining us here. That was economist Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University School of Business and Governance in our weekly slot of the economy.